one of my big worries is that the modern democracies have taken many of these questions right off the moral and political table. In Canada, and you probably heard me say this before, they were taken all off the table by kicking sensitive moral legislation upstairs to the courts. Now, I understand that in Israel, hope this doesn't get me in trouble, you've just had Netanyahu has just passed a law, Bibi as they call him, has just managed to have a law passed which basically gives your legislature the right to, what's the word I'm looking for, to nullify or ignore judgments of your Supreme Court which go against the law. Now, there are dangers on all sides of these questions. But Canada, for example, since 1982, has had such a provision in our own Constitution. It's called the Notwithstanding Clause, Section 33 of Canada's Constitution. Hasn't been used very much, maybe 3 times since 1982. I thought it would be used more. But the reason it's not is because it's not getting challenged, because people would know it would embarrass them to have it used against them, the courts, I mean. But at any rate, that section of our Constitution allows any of the 10 provinces of Canada to simply ignore a prohibition of the Supreme Court for 5 years. And at the end of the 5 years, they can renew it again if they want to. But what it's basically saying is that the will of the people is sovereign and not the will of unelected judges. And now some people, especially left liberals of an ideological nature, are going to say, but the judges are smarter than the elected officials. I know that our own Pierre Trudeau said that. He basically referred to his own parliamentarians, his words, as a bunch of nobodies. He had no respect for them because he grew out of the French tradition of code law, or what we call here charter law. His idea was, look, there's one best way to do everything. Why do we have each of the 10 provinces of Canada have a different solution to problem A and a different solution to problem B? There should only be one solution. In fact, he was even say there can only be one logical solution to any problem, and the job of the legislators is to find that one perfect solution. And now that's from the French tradition, which begins with Rousseau, his idea of the social contract, and especially the idea of the general will. Now, where did the idea of the general will come from? It actually came from theologians in the past who argued, like Malebranche. Malebranche was a famous French intellectual, and he argued that God only deals in generalities. God makes general statements and general moral laws. For example, thou shalt not kill. He doesn't say you should not kill your uncle and you should not kill your neighbor. He just says thou shalt not kill. It's a general law, not what was called a particular law. Well, this whole idea of the virtue of general law versus particular law became very important in the French tradition. And by the time Malebranche was finished with it, Rousseau got a hold of it. And he basically relied on this whole concept of the general will. I want to say again, because I think I've said it before, so I hope I'm not boring you. What's the difference between, for example, a majority rule and the general will? Well, here it is. In a democracy like ours, for example, most democracies, a majority rule means that if you have 50% plus one vote, that's majority rule. And of course, it can go higher. It can go right to 100%. But once you get over 50%, you have majority rule, and that's the choice that's going to be made by your legislature, right? Where sovereignty of the people resides in the legislature and in the laws made by the people. The general will is a different idea. The general will is the idea, very abstract idea, that there can only be one right way to do something. It's got to be out there. You know, there's only one right way to ski, you know what I mean? There's only one right way to grow potatoes. There's only one right way to run a country or a government. We know that right way, the best way, is out there somewhere. And just because you don't see it, because you're only paying attention to your particular desires and your particular will to have things your way instead of yielding to the general will and looking for the one best solution for all the people, it is out there somewhere. The question, of course, became, where is it? Well, for Rousseau, it was obvious in many situations, but for many situations, it wasn't. So he decided in his Social Contract, which is a very famous and disturbing book, beautifully written, unfortunately, because he was a great prose stylist and admired all over Europe for his fictions, like his novels and so on. But he was a great political writer too, although I think he was deeply wrong in the direction that he took all of Europe by insisting on the general will. And so, because the people often can't see the general will initially, we're going to have what he called a legislator, capital L, legislator, who will decide for the people what the general will is. And then he wrote in his little book, I'm not quoting, I'm just paraphrasing, everybody needs to choose the general will. And if you decide on your particular will over the general will, we have a right to execute you. You can be basically killed by the state for going against the general will of the people. You see how that's very different from the idea of an open and free nation in which majority rule is the only standard, not a general will. These things are in deep conflict, and it was Rousseau's idea which led to totalitarianism in the French Revolution and what they call the Terror, 1792, 1793, and so on, in which hundreds of thousands of French people were slaughtered, murdered, dissected, butchered. Their skin was used for lampshades and their gold pulled out of their teeth and sold. And just like in the Second World War, they were the first to do it. But anyway, the whole reason behind it was we're supporting the general will and you're not. Boom, boom, you're dead. You know. So anyway, I don't know where I was going with that, except to say that in the West, the so-called sovereignty of the people is still the rule. And in the British tradition, which was the format for so many European nations, which kind of came to democracy after Britain. I mean, Britain was the freest nation in the world for like a long, long time before countries like France and Germany and others even became consolidated nations and admired the British way of doing. You know, Montesquieu wrote his Spirit of the Laws about the British system of checks and balances and all that sort of thing. But the sovereignty of the people was considered the supreme law of the nation. Now, that is still the case in England, because England has no written constitution. It has a common law, which goes way back like 1,000 years and is incredibly powerful legal force in the country. And it has a legislature and a Senate, House of Commons and a House of Lords, as they call them, and so on. And of course, the Americans follow that, so do the Canadians, the three-part structure of a legislature, a Senate, and an executive, and a court, four-part structure. So, but the whole idea that ran through that was sovereignty of the people. Well, then what happened in Canada in 1982 was Trudeau, who was raised in the Rousseau French tradition, he simply couldn't stand the idea that, as I say, that each of our provinces, 10 provinces, have their own legislatures, and they're making laws about the same thing, a little different from each other. For example, one province would say, here are the rules about drinking alcohol in the province of Ontario, where I live. Quebec, which is mostly French Canadians, they like drinking more than we do. They would say, well, here are the rules about drinking alcohol in Quebec. They're a little bit different legislation, and it drove Trudeau nuts. You know, I'm not saying he ruled on drinking, although in a way he did, because he banned the cross-border transportation of alcohol and that kind of stuff. I think it was him. But at any rate, he couldn't stand the idea. He said, you English are crazy. He said, you change your laws as often as you change horses when you're traveling. The law changes everywhere you go in England, you know. And of course, in terms of the common law, that was true. But so what he did was, not single-handedly, because our own Supreme Court, as it then existed, forbade him from creating a Charter of Rights and Freedoms by himself, or else he would have done it. They forced him to cooperate with all 10 provinces, which he did, and eventually he got what he wanted in 1982. Queen came over and signed it and so on. So what that basically did was it transferred the supreme law of the nation, which was Parliament, Parliament was considered the supreme law, it transferred it to the court. And what it basically now says is that the Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the supreme law of Canada, subject only to this and that and so on, you know. But if that was a radical shift, to take the idea of supreme law from the mouth of the people for whom we vote and we feel represent us or should, and put it in the hands of judges who in Canada are appointed by who? By the Prime Minister, who happens to be either a Liberal Prime Minister or a Conservative Prime Minister. And if vacancies come up in the court, he's going to stuff the court with people who believe like he does, and so on. So even though Canadians are unaware of this change, unaware of the shift, and unaware that their sovereignty has been kicked out the back door, and now it resides in the Supreme Court way over their heads, they think the Charter is fantastic. Most of them have never read it. I'm one of the only Canadians I have ever met who's actually read the Charter from beginning to end. It's only about 30 short pages. It's an easy read. But Canadians don't read it. They just think it's great because it's the highest law of the land. It must be good. And when you tell them that, how do you feel about judges making decisions about things like gay marriage and abortion and capital punishment and all the rest of it, and you have no say through the people that you send to Parliament? Judges are smart people, you know, that kind of thing. Lazy. So my view is, and my criticism of the whole procedure of replacing the supreme law of Parliament with the supreme law of unelected judges, is that you have infantilized, made childlike the whole process of the people working out their own laws in their own debating body, their own deliberative body, rather, I should say. That's where they're supposed to deliberate. And the whole idea is that the different parties come together and they don't agree with each other initially, but they argue back and forth and they make concessions and they bend a little here and they give something there, they take something there, and they end up with a law that everyone votes on, and everyone, as a friend of mine said, is equally unhappy. But at least they're equally unhappy, and it's a pretty good law. It's not the best law that I think we could have had, but let's do it. And it is the voice of the people. Well, I can't say much about Israeli politics, but I think what Bibi was trying to do in your country was get rid of what the kind of thing that Trudeau did in our country, which was transfer the sovereignty of the people to the courts and basically take it back when there were judgments made by the court, which the people simply did not agree with. So I hope I got that right, but that's what I saw happening anyway.
William, we kept you for too long. I think we should let you go to dinner. Of course, we appreciate the information and your time and kindness, but it's been very long for you, I think.
Thank you so much. Great to be with you.